and welcome everybody to the Creators Corner. My name is Chris Barrows, and I'm here on the Tabletop Express, excited to welcome aboard Frank West to the Tabletop Express. Thanks for coming, Frank.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Chris. Thank you for inviting me. I'm excited to be here just as much, so it's great.
Well, look, I kick this off with the same question for every person, and it goes back to your origins in board games. Not necessarily designing per se, but that first game that kind of, when you think back, gets you excited about those memories, those emotions, those experiences. What game comes to mind for you when you kind of go back to that origin story?
Oh, it's always a difficult one for me because I feel like my journey was very over many years and very organic and very gradual. So I, like many people, played games like Monopoly and stuff when I was a young kid. And then I had a family who they tried once a week to kind of play like poker or just a card game or something, not gambling or anything, but just playing a game. And then as I kind of got into my early teens, I started playing a lot of Magic the Gathering. So for me, in many ways, Magic the Gathering is probably my first input to this kind of world, and I played that heavily for 4 or 5 years, and I competed at tournaments and really got into Magic. And then when I went to university, that stopped, and then I didn't touch this kind of stuff again for another kind of 5-10 years. And then I started going to some groups that started playing the odd board game, and I remember I went to a convention for web development, and some people were playing a game called Snake Oil. And I don't know if you've heard of Snake Oil, but Snake Oil is basically where you're creating pitches for businesses. So it was quite a common game at these shows because it was all about people trying to create businesses, so they turned it into a game. So I played that a lot, but it wasn't until 10 years ago where I suddenly got into these modern games, and it was just like a non-stop roller coaster from there. And it was just so many games all at once that I don't think there's particularly one game that was the trigger point, but I certainly remember 2 games, which were Eclipse and Dead of Winter, which were 2 games that kind of had a really big impact on me. They've really kind of changed my views of board games being something that's, a boring version of a video game to something that can be comparative to a video game, something that can be just as interesting, just as advanced, just as complex, and have just as much kind of interesting stuff. So I guess that was that starting point for me to an extent.
Well, it's interesting too, because we're coming to the point now where it's evolved almost to the sense. I mean, I just watching Stardew Valley sell out in a day in board games.
Oh, it's crazy.
It started as a mobile app. I mean,
and this that video games now are trying to become board games. And even when like Mechs versus Minions came out a few years ago from Riot, who were League of Legends, and people kind of said, they did it as a hobby because there was no money to be made for their business. But since then, you can name probably 50 different giant companies, giant video game IPs that are now rolling out into this board game hobby. And it's so fantastic to see that kind of evolution.
There is definitely a demand for it, but a lot of the stuff, obviously, that you've worked on doesn't necessarily have a gigantic IP attached. You've been obviously extremely creative in your process. But I want to talk a little bit about the fact that your journey in terms of kickstarting and having that first game come out, it starts really, I guess, 2015 in a designing process, and you go for some time before it actually kickstarts. So what goes into, for you, I should say, what went into that process of making that first game, which I believe was the City of Kings?
Yeah, so I worked on many games throughout my life kind of for fun, and most of those were video games. I was a programmer and developer, so I made lots of games for myself for my own kind of pleasure and entertainment. And when in 2015 I started commuting to Amsterdam, so another country to where I live, and spending a lot of time in hotels. And most people when they're in Amsterdam on their own kind of go out and party and kind of live the life. And for me, I was like, hey, I've got all this free time. I can sit in a room in a hotel and work on a board game. So I started designing this game, and I'd come home at the weekends and play test it with my girlfriend, and we kind of worked on it, and I'd go off. And it really was back then a fun thing. You know, I never had any intentions for this to become my life. I was very happy with my work and the kind of life that I had. It worked very well. But as the City of Kings design started to evolve a little bit, I started to get more and more excited by it. And I liked this idea of, well, maybe I should make a copy for me. You know, maybe when I'm older, I can look back and say, this is something I created, and show it to my kids. Or, you know, I'm one of these corny people that always imagines myself in my 80s with like a grandkid sat on my knee or something and telling them the stories of my life. And I was like, I could have this on my shelf. And then, you know, as I started working with that, I started playtesting it with friends and other people. And I was like, maybe we should get some artwork. So I found an artist and started working with them. And it was, I don't know, like probably a good year into it where I kind of thought to myself, well, maybe Kickstarter and actually trying to turn this into something that other people might want to have would be kind of an option. So it was a very organic process. You know, I was never expecting that first game to do anywhere near as well as it did. And whilst I put the effort and the research and the time into that, it was always kind of, what's that next step? You know, what is it that I would like to have happen next that kind of just led that journey?
But it sounds like one of the things that you're talking to that I've noticed with a lot of people who found success was because one, the myth of Kickstarter being this big financial boom on your first game has been a myth that's been dispelled by numerous guests at this point.
Oh, yes.
But this seems like it's something like you're saying, like many other people are saying, it was born out of joy, the joy of the actual gaming. And then it just happened to turn into something that was plausible and work. And it worked out obviously really well, but joy was at the heart of it. It seems like.
I think passion is such a key part of being a creator. And I see a lot of people that come up to me and say, can anyone design a game? Can anyone run a Kickstarter? Can anyone do this? And fundamentally, the answer is yes, right? Anyone can do it. And with enough learning, enough of this and enough of that, you can go through that process. But if you don't have that spark, if you don't have that kind of that fire, you know, that's burning inside you that wants this to happen, then it's really hard to convince other people to join you on that journey, right? And this is, even to today, I have a standard that I say to people, which is, if I can't stand in front of you and look you in the eyes and say, I think this is a good game, you should buy it, then I'm not going to release it. And I've had games that I've worked on for years, spent fortunes on artwork and developing, and I've just not found that final spark. You know, it's been fine, it's been good by a lot of publisher standards. I'm sure they would release it, but for me, it just, I didn't have that passion for it, so it kind of went on that shelf. And I feel a lot of people who go to Kickstarter, you know, if you have that joy and you have that passion and you can show that to people, you're still going to get those people join you and kind of join that journey. You've still got to tick the boxes, right? You still got to do the work. You still got to study. You still got to get your prices right and whatnot. But it helps. It's kind of, it's the icing that helps you kind of get over those first few kind of milestones.
Yeah, and like anything else, I mean, there's a lot of work that goes into it. So when the joy is connected, I imagine it just adds to the fun of it, because you do need that on some of those days when especially when you're trying to fulfill.
Yes.
But one of the things in particular, and as I've probably noted about a few people who've come on here, I love to look at the bios and kind of descriptions, how people describe the games they create. One thing that you write, this is on your Twitter bio in particular, and everyone can follow you at City of Games HQ on Twitter. But you say, I design and publish games focusing on immersive themes, fun mechanics, and beautiful components. I want to talk a little bit to this because, one, I love all of these things. I think those are important. I've talked a lot about how the tactile picking up of a piece to a game is just so important. And that's what differentiates it from digital to begin with. But thinking about kind of the three things that you put together, why are those three things the kind of that focal point for you?
I think for me, you need all three of them to make a product good, right? You think of them as like the three pillars that have the kind of the platform on top. And if one of those pillars isn't quite up to standards, everything's going to kind of slant off in one direction, and it's never going to give you that full experience. You need something to be fun, you need people to enjoy it, right? You can have amazing mechanics that mathematically create these really cool puzzles and kind of situations. But if people at the end of it just go, yeah, I basically did a spreadsheet, I filled in a form, I did a survey. It's not a fun experience. It's just an experience. And the element of fun is really critical. But equally, feeling like you're immersed in that story, immersed in that world to some degree. And that can be light, right? I believe that to some extent, an abstract game, a fully abstract game, can still feel immersive in its own way if you set that scene correctly. Like, it's obviously a much harder reach than if you've got some big giant elaborate game, but still allowing people to understand what they're doing and not just kind of talking about the mechanics, but the actual kind of thematical explanations behind those things is so critical. And the components, you said yourself, right? One of the reasons many of us play these games is because we want to touch them, we want to hold them, we want to interact with them. And there's nothing worse than, like, I don't know, picking up some like cards and them just feeling flimsy and not shuffling and bending and kind of, it just it's that last moment, right? I want you to open the box and to have an experience. And for me, the experience of a game starts the second you take that lid off. It's not once you've learned the rules and you're sat at the table with your friends. It's the second you open that box. You need people to look at it and just go, wow, look at this cool stuff. Look at this piece. Look at that, and get excited and have 15 or 20 minutes of fun before they even care about the rule book. And that's kind of why the components are so important, is that kind of part of that trio of items.
It's funny that you say that too, because around my desk, I was recording something the other day, and because I was recording this the other day, I just happen to have random board game pieces around my desk. I'm even thinking I've got like the one of the bears from the bear piece from Everdell from one of the expansions is sitting here with it. Like, I think of this, but these pieces, like, they do matter. Like, I think about that fact that it adds to just the joy that you do get from it, the idea of picking up, moving it along. And the way that I think they've become so much more even interactive than ever before, because now we're putting meeples on top of things. Tiny Epic made it so your meeples held things. I mean,
and this all helps on that immersion, right? This is where I was kind of saying, you could have an abstract game that's immersive through the materials. If you've got a wooden soldier and you're physically attaching a sword to it, it doesn't matter if that's got a story around it or not, anything. You understand what you're doing. You understand you're arming that thing. You're preparing that thing. And that immerses you in that experience so much more than just looking at something and just going, oh yeah, that's a cube, or that's this, or that's that kind of thing.
And how does that, as you think about it, how does that come into the design of the game? Because obviously you're trying to design something that is mechanically sound, that works, that is enjoyable, but at what point in your process are you actually thinking about that kind of interactivity or that immersiveness? Is it constant? Are these all things all happening thinking at once, or is there kind of a breakdown in the way that you do it?
I think I'm probably one of the few who is thinking about the physical components right from day one. And I don't know how much of that is because I do the Kickstarter and the marketing and publishing myself, and I'm aware of what's kind of affordable and what's viable, but also because I'm thinking about that experience. And for me, this is one of the reasons that I'm not a huge fan of digital playtesting. Obviously, over the last year, digital playtesting has become a big thing. And I think digital playtesting is great for some purposes, but it misses out that kind of interactions and those experiences you get of doing something. So a great example of this is in the early days of the City of Kings, you had a mechanism where you'd go and gather wood from a forest. And to do that, you would have a deck of cards and you would draw a card and it would say, you've got 1 wood, you've got 2 wood, or something bad would happen. If you got better at gathering wood, you would draw 2 cards. And if you got better and better, you would draw 3 and then you'd draw 4. And this was really cool, right? Because different cards give you different numbers, but you kind of knew roughly what to expect. But every so often there'd be a bad one that would do something horrific and you wouldn't know if it was coming or not. But what I discovered was it was cool, but it took so long to draw these cards constantly and then have to shuffle the deck and re-go through the deck. And early on, I kind of said, well, what happens if I just replace that with 5 dice? You start by rolling 1, then you roll 2, then you roll 3, then you roll 4, then you roll 5. You can do it all in one go. You never have to reshuffle them. You can just leave them where they land. You just pick them up, roll them, and go. And for a 3-hour game, it took a good 10 minutes off the playtime just making that single change. And from an experience perspective, people preferred rolling the dice, right? People liked to chuck them. People enjoyed that. And it still had the exact same effects of you got 1, 2, 3, or something bad happened, and kind of different percentages of those things. But it was a real component change that, as I say, mechanically didn't really change the game, but it did totally change that experience. And that was, when it was still a hand-drawn prototype right in those kind of early days.
And that is true. You could not experience that because it's enough on, and they're fantastic platforms because you've got a Tabletopia or these other places where, you can play the games, right? But it is different when it's physically there, and it's going to take time on any of the digital platforms to draw your cards. So that's a really interesting thing about playtesting. How do you face those challenges when you go through something like what has just happened, or when you want to get the perspective of, say, someone who is maybe not, right around the corner from you, but you really would value their, opinion. Are you taking that in a different way, or are you just looking for different feedback that isn't going to completely fill all the gaps?
So I've pretty much put a complete halt on all development of big complex games that I was working on prior to this kind of situation. And instead, I've been focusing on smaller games that have much more less kind of physical interaction requirements, and also games which are kind of expansions and extensions of existing stuff where I know people with a small print and play kind of thing can add it to an existing game to kind of develop that further. So for me, I find that in-person testing so important for my personal creation process that it literally put a halt on the development of those new games for nearly 12 months now.
Well, we do have a question, actually, and I will share it here. We have a question from Josh saying, what's the mechanic you really enjoy that you haven't incorporated into one of your games yet?
Oh, boy. Okay. So I think my answer to this probably would be a surprise to a lot of people who know me, like through my games, but not in person. And I think the answer to that would be RealTime. I would love to develop a real-time game. I really personally enjoy real-time games and games where that clock is ticking and you just have to make decisions and have to keep going. However, I kind of view it as a mechanic that's hated by a vast group of people. And at the moment, as someone who's still trying to grow my kind of like following people who are interested in me and my games, I don't dare use a mechanic like that where I think that 95% of them wouldn't want to kind of jump in. But I would love to do a real-time game at some point.
So I do have to ask you about a game that is sitting right behind me right now. At least the box cover is. One thing in that box cover is a spot specifically designed for your cat to go. Yeah. And I just think it is one of the, it's to me, well, there's two things about this. One, well, I want to talk about the game too, but I first want to talk about what goes into just seems like a rather simple decision of what to put in terms of copy or text or visual inside your box. But what's the story kind of behind ultimate decision to kind of put that inside the box when creating Isle of Cats? It's just a really neat thing to me. And there's photos all over the internet of cats inside the Isle of Cats box.
It's funny because, so this all relates to the inside of the box. There's a little target symbol and it says cat setup and place your cat here before you can't start playing the game as an optional setup rule. And it's funny because it was the one thing that I did with that game that I told nobody. I came up with this idea and I said to my partner, Sarah, I said to her, I've got this idea, and people are going to either love it or they're going to hate it. It's either going to be something that people are going to get behind and really enjoy, or they're going to look at it as kind of a cheesy, cheapening kind of thing. And I was really 50-50 about whether it was going to get taken the right way. And the problem is I didn't want to tell anybody. So I took that decision on myself and just went, I'm going to go with this, because I love this concept of people, their cats always go and sit in their boxes, and kind of making a deal of it and encouraging people to take photos and kind of spread that. Obviously, from a marketing perspective, is fantastic, but more than that, beyond the marketing, beyond any other thing, the key part of that decision was I wanted someone who opened that box to look at it and go, the person who made this understands cats. There's someone who has cats, or they know cats, or they experience cats. And to me, as you know, I said earlier about that experience of when you open the box, right? I want you to enjoy the box before you play the game. And for the vast majority of cat owners, when they open the box and they see that, it gives them a connection and a kind of a bonding to that game, something exciting before they even get to the game. And that's the best place you can kind of be with a game design before someone started playing it.
It's true on the marketing side. I mean, I do marketing and social media specifically for a living in my full-time work, and it's catchy and it's so sociable. So it's great for that purpose too. I want to talk about Isle of Cats a little bit. This particular game, one, you talked a little bit about that combination of abstract and story versus, mending the worlds. And I mean, Board Game Geek's description on this, literally just for those who have not played Isle of Cats, literally says the rescue as many island cats as you can before Lord Vesh comes to destroy their home. So the plot and the story is there, obviously. But this game, components-wise, as you spoke to, fantastic components. We're filling these boats with these cats that we're trying to rescue, and it has done really, really well. Better than I had even realized, because I went on Board Game Geek right before this conversation, and it's literally just at the top 100 in overall rank, and it's the number 10 family game. And Board Game Geek, I love it, but it's very heavy on the heavy.
Yes.
Gloomhaven number one a long time. Gloomhaven is a game that sat in a box in my house. Yet Isle of Cats and all these other games have been played. So this being number 10 family and one almost top 100, it's a pretty big accomplishment. Talk about this game a little bit and kind of what went into the idea behind this one, because there's a lot of fun going on in this.
Cool. Well, thank you first. I appreciate the kind words about the game and the kind of stuff about it. But for me, I am so happy to see where this game's kind of got to, and to see it still kind of rising up and climbing up. And as you say, to be number 10 for family games, for me, is in some ways a bigger deal than being like near the top 100 for all games, just because it's such a great achievement to realize that it's one of those few family games that have kind of risen up the ranks on Board Game Geek. I think the thing that kind of works so well about this game, and it was a deliberate decision when I started making it, was it ticks a lot of boxes. So firstly, it's got your standard kind of 2 to 4 player game that takes 60 to 90 minutes, and it offers enough challenge without being too complicated. It's a game that you can pick up and learn as you play. The second time you play it, you're going to do better than the first time, and you're going to kind of have your head around it. It then has a full solo mode, which means people can play it completely on their own. And the solo mode wasn't just get some points. It was a tailor designed extra mode where you're competing against this kind of AI sister player that's fighting you, and it's kind of means that you feel like you're playing with other players. It then has, in addition to that kind of standard rulebook, a secondary set of rules, which is a single A4 sheet that allows you to play it with young children or kind of people who don't play board games, that really pushes it into kind of that gateway kind of first game kind of category. And then on top of that, it has the 5 and 6 player expansion that allows you to play it with up to 6 people should you wish to. So I think because it has all of those kind of boxes ticked, it gives it the widest audience possible. And that theme is very, very appealing to people. People kind of know that it's going to be cute and kind of friendly and fun. And I really did my best to kind of play off that with the mechanics, so people felt like they were doing something good. One of the things that people always say to me is, isn't the theme a little bit silly? You know, it's this fantasy island with all these magical creatures and you're going there to rescue them from this bad guy. And I kind of sit there and think, well, fundamentally, if you actually look into the heart of it, the story of this game is there's an island that is at risk of being destroyed by this big evil person, and we're going there to save the wildlife and to kind of create kind of a safe place for these creatures. And, you know, without getting political, this is something that very much relates to what's going on in the world at the moment. And to me, it's a more fun way of kind of just showing that message of like, let's rescue and kind of share. And I think that all of those different aspects coming together just really helps the game kind of step up above maybe some of the others that are out there.
And one thing it does that I think is impressive, it has a lot of mechanisms that I think you don't always get in entry level, or I just want to say entry level. I like this. It's more of this kind of first opportunity to try modern games, right?
I called it a 2 out of 5 complexity game, right? Where it's not kind of right in that bottom level, but it's not big, heavy, complex kind of areas.
Yeah, but what it does have, I mean, you've got card drafting in this. You do have hidden points. There's a variety of these things that are in there. So you can teach a lot of those things and then get them into other games, bring them, but then still go back to this and have a good time. And I think that's always the impressive thing. It's not a game that gets, you know, pushed to the side per se, because you can come back to this over and over. And it's got the polyominoes, which I note a little bit more popular in recent months or in recent years. Probably, I don't want to say ahead of the time, but it comes around that time when polyominoes start being, I think, a little bit popular. At least I started to see them a lot more around 2019, 2018 myself. But a very fun game. We're going to have, just for everyone watching, there is going to be an episode coming to the channel probably in the next 2 weeks of Is This Game For You? So if you're looking to learn more about this game in particular, learn a little bit more about that, come on back for that. Timing to be determined, because my usual counterpart for that, his wife is going to be having a baby soon. So I have to
prioritize a little.
Yeah. I mean, timing is what timing is. But that said, first and foremost, I've really enjoyed my conversation with you. I want to thank you for your time. I think, again, you brought a lot of different perspectives into this. In particular, the way you talk about immersion. And for those who joined late, I encourage you to go back and just listen. You talk about it in a different way, because a lot of times people talk about immersion as getting immersed in the game, but you know, the way you've spoken to immersion, I think is a little bit unique. It's getting immersed in not just the story, it's the pieces, it's every aspect of it. And I really appreciate that perspective. But for those designers out there, as you mentioned, who say, I do want to design a game, I want to get out there and I want to be a game designer, what kind of advice do you give to them? Because as you noted, yeah, anyone can do it, but to do it well, that is a little bit of a different level altogether.
I think the first thing you have to do is realize that the first idea you have isn't necessarily going to be the best idea, and don't be afraid to throw an idea away. I see a lot of people that spend years working on a game because they've told everyone about this game, right? And they don't want to kind of be seen as a failure. They don't want to seem to kind of mess up, and they get too committed to that. And I think that you have to focus on what that game is. And fundamentally, the only way you can do that is through playtesting. So a little story for me, the City of Kings, which is my first game, it was a good 6 to 12 months of development or design and creation where only me and my girlfriend played it. I talked to people about it before I started getting other people to play it. These days, when I design new games, I typically try to get someone playing it within 24 hours of me coming up with the idea. And that doesn't mean a full, complete game. Sometimes that might just be, hey, there's this game I'm creating, it's got this new combat system. Let's just sit down and have a few fights and play it out. But it's so critical just to play it. Don't wait for it to be finished. Don't wait for the whole game to work. If you've got something that works, play it. And as I say, if it's, imagine City of Kings, big adventure game, lots and lots of stuff, fighting is a small part of it. But if you've got a game like that and your fighting works, just playtest that, because that would inspire the other things that you want to kind of develop. People say to me, I'm stuck, I don't know how to do this bit. And it's kind of like, well, playtest the rest of it and you'll see, you'll learn, you'll decide, does that need to exist or what is that solution? So the first thing I'd say to people really is just playtest so early on. And then if you want to actually go further, just study. If you want to become a publisher, you want to do a Kickstarter, start reading about it now, because it takes so much longer to learn logistics and manufacturing and get quotes and kind of work with reviewers than you would expect. And you want to spend 12 months studying that side of things before you launch that first Kickstarter.
No, really good advice. And I would say one thing that stands out to me is if I've ever played a game and something didn't quite work, and I wonder how this got into the game. I always wonder where in the process it was. And what you're talking about is if it's going to have fighting and the fighting doesn't work, isn't good, well, now the rest of the game may not work. So you've got to get that fixed up pretty quick. But that is great advice. I appreciate it. Again, everyone has the opportunity to connect up with Frank, in particular on Twitter. That's at City of Games HQ. I am going to tell y'all, of course, if you have enjoyed Creators Corner, I've had a lot of great conversations with some great people. So I hope you give it a like and subscribe here on the channel. More of that coming. And a lot of other different content here from myself and some other associates who joined me on this channel. And I want to thank you for tuning in tonight here on the Tabletop Express. As I said, this has been Creators Corner. Again, my guest, thank you again to Frank West for joining me here. And with that, I'm just going to say good night. Thank you for tuning in, and I'll see all of you very soon.